So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the scripture from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Yitzack lineage. So then we understand what's coming in terms of then the time of the end. As then we read from Yishmael, the 61st chapter, a section of this specific chapter then relates with the spring feast, and then a section of it related with autumn feast. And then much later the Messiah came and he completed the spring feast, and then he started his reign for 1,000 years. As he then was born as a king, so then his 1,000 years had started. So then later came the 1,000 years of the deceit of Nahashatan. Then in 2009 the deceit time had ended, and we then return to the holy cities, where then we find the understanding then explaining the cities laid waste for many centuries. These cities then are returning, and then we find in Yishmael the first site where the first holy city is going to be at, in the land of Cush. As we can read very precisely, very then simply, in Yishmael 1:8, you find over there the position of the first holy city via then tabernacling. There is the only word in the entire understanding of Yishmael the prophet where you find then tabernacle, an action word, or then continuing action of the word tabernacle, tabernacling. So then you find then the Messiah obviously being absolutely true of his objective, coming out of Jerusalem himself as then the living instruction, also including the Quran, because the Messiah was the younger brother and he had his objective. However, he was then also teaching many understandings of Yishmael. The situation is we have only 10% of the teachings of the Messiah during the time of his spring feast. If you then put together the Gospels as we understand the autumn feast, you find only 10%, roughly 10%, and a lot of it sometimes is repetitious. So then the Messiah, he did recognize the position of his elder brother, because he knew during the time of restoration his elder brother would be in charge of the control of the Gentile level. So then the Messiah could then prepare for his father the coming of the vengeance, because the Creator has said vengeance is his alone. He is the only person in charge of the vengeance. The rest of us, either those of us testifying for the Messiah, we then die in the Messiah and then we rest in the Messiah. And then those of the holy cities, they maintain their services while then vengeance is taking place. Then the Messiah, much later, he shows up and he rescues his people, 20th chapter, and then this age then is destroyed with a shout of sulfur, as he then explained. When you read the Gentile Luke, you understand then as such then would be the ending of this age. So we understand the end of this age is going to end with a shout of sulfur. So then our understanding then is intact from its principles. So then we find ourselves in Yishmael during the time of restoration and reduction. As we understand then, the leader of the Catholic Church then resign very wisely, being a German, because he understands there were a lot of mistakes done by the translators of the scriptures many centuries ago, and obviously it wasn't his fault. But in any situation in this present age, we find as then more information comes up, more equipment then is built, more testings are done, then we find the truth. And we are during the time of restoration, so then we understand that those junkies of the scriptures, they must be straightened out. However, with his resignation then comes the responsibility of the other side to make sure they translate the scriptures properly. It is an obligation of the time and the season because of the restoration period. And then the Creator is not going to come down from heaven in person and then updating the scripture for us. It's our job to do this task. So then, from this viewpoint, we find the entire scripture from the time of Ibrahim and his stationary relationship with his first son. And we understand back then people would get in a relationship after or around 40 years old. So it's fairly safe for us to understand there were at least 40 years of relationship with the first boy, where then Ibrahim became stationary. There was no reason for him to do pilgrimage on the land because he would indicate a level of control of the land without the pilgrimage, because the pilgrimage was then given the objective to the second son. We are not implying areas where then the first son does not have then the ability of doing pilgrimage. It's not the point. The point is, from the original manuscripts we find a couple of objectives. The first son related with a stationary lifestyle with Ibrahim and Hagar, the Egyptian maid he received while he was in Egypt. Then this relationship is stationary, because Ibrahim would teach his son how to relate himself with the existing world at the time where he was at. Proof of it we find in Joseph. Many years later, Joseph then was sold into slavery via Yishmaelite caravan, already indicating for you then what was taking place. They were already taking charge of the land. So then the son of the pilgrimage came later, Yitzack. That's where then Sarah had joy, because she was then sad for many years. It was not easy for her standing before the situation where she was then the legitimate wife and she couldn't say much. And she was not making intrigues, making then tensions in the tent. No, she was very quiet. She was sad for many years. But then her joy was completed when Yitzack was born. By this time, then, prior of the birth of the second son, then Yishmael had his understanding of what his task would then take for him to do the work. So then we find Yishmael, and then he had his mother with him, because she was part of the stationary lifestyle related with control of the land. And then the pilgrimage side was given to the second son. Then came Yitzack, and then came Yaakov. And then the story of Yitzack and his wife was also invented. She did not have any kind of a deceit. Goat's hair and intrigue and deceit and lies, and she did not do any of it. Simply then, when the time came, Yitzack had voiced it out. Esau is evil, he's an evil hunter, he is of the outside, he is very hot-tempered, and he can't have the promise. Yaakov, however, was a person of the home, was a person that was sensitive, a quiet person, and then the promise was given him. Yitzack simply prayed over him and he received it. That was the end of it. The wife has no part in it. Then we find both objectives, the first son and the second son. And the second son later completed the spring feast. Very important. So then he came out of Jerusalem because he was rejected by his very own. He came out as the living Torah, the living instructions. As then the living tabernacle, he came out and he went to the Gentile world. That's where you find then the Messiah on the top of Mount Gerizim. And he was exceedingly received very joyously. And then he went up on the mountain, and then Moshe and Eliyahu showed up to him, indicating, as far as the law is concerned, from the Moshe's side, you are doing 100%. Eliyahu, as far as then the prophets, so far what was done, you have done. And then was there also Shimon, Yaakov, and Yohanan. Very important, Yohanan. So when we are reading then the spring feast, the first person we should make a reference of, Yohanan. Then Yohanan also, he was with the Messiah when he came back from the dead. Because then came the other title. Behold then the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. Then he became the Redemptor. Up to the point when then he was, the Messiah came out of the desert. Then worthy is the Lamb. Only the title, worthy is the Lamb. When he came back from the dead, behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. Because then his objective was completed as Redemptor. So then, we understand he was on Mount Gerizim as the living instructions. Then we read, obviously, the 5th chapter of Gelah, Revelation. That's where he then opened the seals. So truly, when we read then Revelation, Revelation truly starts, or then the autumn feast, when the sound of the shofars then start. Because the Messiah was up on a mountain, he was then opening the seals, then he came down, he gave them 2 days, 2 Yom Creation days, on a level of Gentile. Then they would rule for 2,000 years. And we understand in the region, the Yishmaelites had a hold of, related with Ibrahim. There were pagan cultures over there also under the control. So then, later when the Messiah would complete then the entire spring feast, and then the restoration period would come, then the Messiah previously pointed out, then the elder brother would be in charge of the world's decisions from country to country. They would not, for instance, control what they do, but they would be aware of the most important decisions. They would be involved in a conversation of those big events. And when relevant, they would voice it out. And they would get done what they want. Because they were given from Ibrahim, during the stationary life he had, the Gentile level of the world. That's why we find time of restoration. Then the Creator having the first relationship with Ibrahim, and then giving the first son the birthright, managing the land. The second son then is the pilgrim, related with salvation. And then comes the third nation, neutral, as then the leading trade, namely China. Absolutely neutral. where the nations are going to be then linked up with the computerized system, yet take care of their own situations. So then we observe the world then adjusting itself during this time of restoration and reduction, where then the scripture is the next step, and get the whole scripture updated, starting from the Quran until the Yitzhak lineage of Autumn Feast. The whole works must be then updated. So then this ridiculous fight of then the Yishmaelites and Yitzackites then stops, because each of them, they have their own objectives. Why are they trying to take over each other's objectives for? That's what's causing trouble. So then a team of people should then begin to update the scripture and clearly delineate the first son and the second son and their objectives. So then they go and they do what they should do before the Creator, because we are preparing for the Autumn Feast. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.